Welcome to this morning's American Security Project webinar. This is an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our website and sent to those who registered for the event. All audience members will be muted during the discussion, but please use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions to the panelists. With that, Matthew, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Courtney, and thanks everyone for joining. And also thank you for the brief delay we had getting started. There's occasionally Zoom hiccups, as we all know. So let's jump into it. 2.5 years after the start of the Ukraine war and over 10 years since Russia initially invaded Crimea, I think we can probably safely say that NATO was effectively unprepared for the reality that it saw in 2022. 2014 was certainly a warning, and NATO took it seriously. The Wales summit of that year declared that all allies in the alliance should, and I quote, aim to move towards a 2% guideline within a decade. That is referring to the percentage of GDP that they should be spending on defense. We saw a renewed American effort to reassure its allies in Europe, followed by years of doubt about America's commitment to the alliance, followed yet again by a renewed commitment. Amongst all of this, many NATO members have increased their percentage of defense spending, but after 10 years, the goal still hasn't been fully realized. The alliance has expanded, but the shortfalls and vulnerabilities have become increasingly obvious. In retrospect, it's not clear that NATO members took the 2014 warning seriously enough. Since its founding, we at the American Security Project have attempted to build consensus around what a strategic, long-term picture of U.S. national security looks like. If the past 10 years have taught us anything, it's that the future is unpredictable, and that preparing for that unpredictability must become a central tenet of planning. So here today, in the spirit of being forward-looking and helping us plan for an unpredictable future for NATO, we have three true experts who know the organization inside and out. With us, we have ASP board member Lieutenant General Daniel Christman, who served 36 years in the U.S. Army, culminating as a superintendent at West Point. And he also represented the U.S. as a member of NATO's military committee in Brussels. We have Ms. Rose Gottemoeller, the Stephen C. Házy lecturer at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford University, where she is also a research fellow at the Hoover Institute. While serving at the U.S. State Department, she was also the chief U.S. negotiator on the New START Treaty, and ultimately became the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. At NATO, Ms. Gottemoeller was the Deputy Secretary General from 2016 to 2019. And finally, we have our member of the Consensus for American Security, Ambassador Douglas Lute, who also served as an Army Lieutenant General and retired in 2010 after 35 years of service. Ambassador Lute was the U.S. Ambassador to NATO from 2013 to 2017 and was a key figure in designing the response to the major challenges that NATO saw during this time. So welcome, everyone. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and actually turn it over to each of our panelists individually to opine for a few moments on what they see the future of NATO is, their considerations for what we hope will be a post-Ukraine war future, and we'll jump into some Q&A. Of course, I do encourage all audience members to submit their Q&As via the box at the bottom, and I will do my best to weave those in as we go along. So without further ado, let's General Christman, start with you.
Well, thanks very much, Matthew. I'm really pleased, first, that ASP pulled this together, and second, pleased and indeed honored to have a chance to sit and chat with two colleagues whom I've admired for years, Rose Gottemoeller and Ambassador Doug Lute. It's wonderful to see the two of you here virtually, and thanks for this chance. Just to start, and I'll be very brief here, Matthew, maybe to be a bit provocative, but what I would do is to take issue with the title of our little conference, and that's NATO after the Russia-Ukraine war. Dan Christman view, there's never going to be an after. This Russia tension with the sovereign entity called Ukraine will persist for our lifetimes and for any reasonable NATO planning horizon, mid-term, short-term, strategic, long-term. It's a reality. And as authors, particularly Russian business authors, whom I read a couple of years ago on one of their publications, it's inconceivable to imagine Russia, in their view, without Ukraine. And I think Vladimir Putin made that clear in his essay, I guess in 2021, that talked about this indivisible unity between Ukrainians and Russians. So the bottom line is this reality will persist. The tension on the part of Ukrainians and, frankly, NATO Europe, where Russia has this desire, to, in many respects, sponge the reality of NATO's sovereignty, of Ukrainian sovereignty and independence, even the cultural history, is the bad news. It will persist. And NATO's mission will be to deter Putin and Russian leader misbehavior in terms of trying to destabilize Europe. The bad news. The good news is, if somebody were to envision an institution best able to deter this behavior, this malign behavior on the part of the Russians and Vladimir, it would be NATO. And I think any of us, when we served on active duty in our various responsibilities in the alliance, none of us could have envisioned that Sweden and Finland would join the other 30 to create the at 32, a strategic alliance that, in my judgment, is best positioned to do what needs to be done, and that's the deterrence mission. There will be household tasks. Matthew, you've outlined many of those needed household tasks in your opening statement. We can talk about those as we get into the Q&A. But that's how I view this going forward. We are blessed to have this perfect union of allied nations made, to quote our 16th president, perhaps even more perfect by the addition of Sweden and Finland.
Thank you, General. Ms. Gottemoeller.
Yes, Dan, it's interesting that what Putin wanted was less NATO in Europe and certainly less NATO in Ukraine. And what he got was more NATO in Europe with a longer border, a much longer border with NATO. But also he got a Ukraine that is now becoming interoperable with NATO armed forces, its training, the equipment it's operating. And so, as it was said in the July summit meeting, 75th anniversary of NATO in Washington, Ukraine is irrevocably on the road to NATO membership. So I think that Putin, well, it was an enormous strategic mistake, as we all recognize. I want to, though, present a little bit different view of the future, because I absolutely agree with you. The most likely scenario is a Russia, again, that is going to continue to threaten Europe, continue to threaten its neighbors, Ukraine in particular. And therefore, NATO will, in that case, have a long-term defense requirement, deterrence and defense requirement that will have to continue to be resourced over many decades. But let's just consider the possibility. I think about this as a spectrum of what kind of Russia will we see in the future. The most likely case is the one you presented. The least likely case, but one that I think nevertheless we need to consider, is the possibility that we will see a second fall of Moscow. In this case, not a deterioration and dissolution of the Soviet Union, but essentially a dissolution of the Putin regime and all that it stands for, and a Russia rising from that dissolution and looking again for some kind of a relationship in a more positive sense with allies, not allies, but neighbors in Europe and also in Asia. There will be heavy conditions placed on Russia to assume that kind of position, one of which will be to atone for the pain, suffering, death, and destruction it has caused to Ukraine during this war. And that means a significant recompense, that means helping to pay for reconstruction, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we at least have to think about the possibility that in future Russia will want something of a more positive relationship with NATO, with the West, and also with allies in Asia in a different way from the way it's interacting with China and, yes, the DPRK today. I think of Russia today as a big pariah state, frankly, and in a very negative stance with regard to any kind of useful or mutually productive relationship with us and with our allies and partners. But nevertheless, I think we have to leave that as a possibility for the future. And now, Doug Lute, I'm waiting for you to fight with me about this point.
Go for it.
You won't find much fight from me on that one, Rose. And I too am glad to be with Dan, Christman, and Rose to spend an hour thinking about this tough topic. You know, Matthew, I'm taken back to your introduction and the title of unpredictability. And when I think back over the last, well, certainly during my professional career, our professional career, I think we share pretty much the same timeline. There are two other occasions like today that remind me of just how unpredictable the future can be. So first of all, the period 1989 to 91, nobody predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And after that strategic shock, right, we experienced at least 20 years, and arguably we continue to experience aftershocks from that experience. The second, of course, close to all Americans in particular, was 9/11. We lived for 20 years. In fact, we can argue we're still living with the aftershocks of 9/11. We're still taking our shoes off at the airport if you don't have TSA pre-check and so forth, right? But you look at the eras of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, homeland security, and all of that, right? Those are all repercussions, aftershocks of the unpredictable event on September 11th. And I think the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine by a nuclear superpower, the first major conventional war in Europe since World War II, will over time serve as just another reminder of these strategic shocks with which we then live for, as Dan said, perhaps generations, perhaps 20 or 30 years of aftershocks. So fundamentally, this is unpredictable. We're seeing some of the early aftershocks of the war in Ukraine, obviously in Ukraine itself, right, with displaced persons, refugee flows, impacted the economy. But beyond Ukraine, the re-engineering of the European energy market, the impact on global food security, because of grain supplies and fertilizer supplies out of that region and so forth, right? And so these are just the most immediate near-term shocks. I think in answer to your question, we can't know what the aftershocks are going to be, especially if we look back as precedents of the 1989 and the 2001 experiences.
This brings up this idea of precedence and unpredictability. As we look at what was Gottemoeller mentioned here is, a potential sort of second fall of Russia, in a conceivable future. Are there lessons that we can learn from the first time around that NATO and the member countries can apply to making sure that we don't end up back in the same spot that we were the first time around? And, certainly I think we could look at the cases between World War I and World War II as being similar. Well, we weren't able to prevent the second war. We learned the lessons of the end of the aftermath of the first one to make a better future that involved NATO after the Second World War. So if Russia does change in some fantastical way after this war in some sort of post-Putin environment, what lessons are there that NATO can either apply from its own history or, maybe shouldn't apply?
If maybe I'll start on this because I've been doing some thinking about it. It is true that the Clinton administration, President Clinton himself, made considerable efforts in the 1990 time period to try to develop a good working relationship with Boris Yeltsin and with the Russian government. And that led to this interstate commission that was chaired by Vice President Gore and Prime Minister Chernomyrdin, efforts to really knit the two governments together. Well, it fell apart within a decade, based partially on Yeltsin's bad health and the lack of control he had over the reins of political power in Russia. So are there ways that we can think about, assuming again that Russia is atoning for what it has done in Ukraine, are there ways that we can learn from that period of real effort that went on? But in the end of the day, it's going to be up to the Russians themselves, because it was their political instability at the time, the as we called it, red-brown competition between the remnants of Soviet communist power and nationalism, that I think undid efforts to try to develop an abiding relationship that had some positive aspect to it with the Russian Federation. So I don't know if it's possible. The coalitions will be different, but Russian nationalism that's been Putin's ticket to ride. And with his references back to Russian history, Dan's already talked about that this morning. That's been his ticket to ride. So the strength of that strain of nationalism in Russia will be something to contend with going forward.
Let me just pick up with what Rose said. It's fascinating you mentioned President Clinton, Rose, because the story I was going to tell was almost exactly where you began your discussion, and that's with Clinton and Stroke Talbot's effort to reach out to Boris Yeltsin. I was privileged to be at a lunch at Hyde Park in 1995 when Yeltsin came to the UN General Assembly meeting, and President Clinton hosted him at FDR's library. And Clinton also made sure he attended the 50th anniversary celebration of the end of World War II, not in London, but in Moscow. That was an interesting debate within the Clinton security team. So the point of all this reminiscing here was to reinforce what Rose was saying about the importance of dialogue. Administrations have tried, and they certainly tried early on when Putin took over, to understand what the sentiments were, what the strategy, the inner workings of the Kremlin might be. Bush 43 certainly tried that. President Obama certainly tried working with Medvedev. And I think too often, both the alliance and U.S. leaders get frustrated at the inability to make the connection. We've had that with the People's Republic for quite some time, finally getting a military dialogue underway. But if there is one key lesson, it would seem to me, and that's to make every effort, either directly or through cutouts, through third parties, to make sure that with respect to transitions in the Russian Federation, we are as close as we can to those sources of information, of intelligence for a potential new team, or even within Putin's present party, to try to divine what's next.
So just a couple further thoughts. You know, I think it's true that there's a pattern that these authoritarian regimes like Putin's, these empires appear to be solid, stable, and almost enduring from the outside, but prove over time to be very brittle from the inside, right? Nobody predicted what happened in '89, for example, right? And my sense is that the Russian Federation today is a smaller scale empire, similar with some parallels to the Soviet Union, right? So you have elements inside the Federation which are not ethnically Russian. And while Putin plays on Russian nationalism, that doesn't ring true uniformly across the Russian Federation. And you're beginning to see, I think, you've seen on the periphery of Russia itself, some challenges, especially in Central Asia, for example. So there may be some brittleness beginning to appear here on the periphery of the Federation, which could easily migrate into the Federation itself. So you may see some challenges from inside. I think another thing we should pay attention to is that the first priority with the fall of the Soviet Union, the first American national security priority, was the security of the nuclear weapons, right? And of course, at that time, both Kazakhstan and Ukraine had sizable nuclear arsenals, and the idea here was, how do you prevent loose nukes? Not my favorite phrase, but illustrative, right? Well, we should remember that the Russian Federation today has 5,000 nuclear weapons. And so when we talk about the potential political fragmentation of the Russian Federation, I think we have to take seriously this now perhaps repeating challenge of the security of nuclear weapons, nuclear materials, and nuclear know-how.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect segue into a question that I have about the way that we think about nuclear deterrence nowadays. And certainly with this war, Putin has certainly flagrantly and maybe fallaciously waved around his nuclear arsenal as a threat, reminding everybody that he does have these weapons. But, even though we see Russia actually facing an invasion across its own border at this point, we haven't heard much more talk about that. So I'm wondering, and Rose, I think this might be particular to you, given your role in negotiating the New START treaty. As we're looking to a potential post-war environment, does NATO need to rethink how it's considering deterrence and maybe even arms control? I know the Russians would love to have a more multilateral agreement that probably included other members of NATO. Is that something that NATO should consider? Should it reconsider the way it deploys its nuclear forces? What are your thoughts, particularly as New START is sort of on its last legs at this point?
Easy answer with regard to NATO and its deployments, no. I think actually that it is an aspect. NATO is, I think, a very good expression of integrated deterrence in that conventional forces, political power, the economic power of Europe, and the North Atlantic, Canada and the United States allies are all intertwined in a very significant way. And the nuclear deterrent is an important aspect of that, but it is, you know, it's all part of a fabric. And we have done a lot in recent years to modernize the extended nuclear deterrent in Europe, including the deployment now of the B-61-12 warhead, a very good modernized warhead across the force there. There's a very small number there, relatively small number, but they are in now modernized format. The Allies are buying the the dual capable aircraft, the F-35, and that debate was hot and heavy while Doug and I were at NATO, but it's been resolved now and the Allies are purchasing those aircraft. So it's a settled matter, the strength of the US nuclear extended deterrent together with allies in NATO Europe, and I think that essentially that's something the Soviets have gone after at the negotiating table. The Russians continue to opine that this is something they want to go after, but I think it is actually a tool not only for extended nuclear deterrence in Europe, but it's also a tool to ensure the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons to other NATO states. And we see some debates in NATO Europe nowadays about potentially acquiring nuclear weapons in Europe. And it's that extended NATO nuclear deterrent that is the tool that really puts the cap on those kinds of discussions and debate. So in the end of the day, I think it's really important that we sustain that nuclear deterrent and we, yes, continue to talk about issues of concern to the Russians. But to my mind, the issue that concerns them most and should concern them now, seeing this missile duel going on in the Ukraine war, is constraining and controlling short time of flight nuclear missiles that could hit Moscow, could hit strategic command and control and other major strategic targets. So that should be at the top of their priority list, is getting constraints and controls. It's, as I call it, putting the N back in INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, banned all missiles in the intermediate ranges, 500 to 5,500 kilometers in range. But I think nowadays we really should and must focus on the priority of preventing a kind of nuclear threat in this range. That would be short time of flight. That would be the most stabilizing step we could take in the near term in the arms control realm, in my view.
On that, do you think that the Russians are likely to desire some sort of replacement for New START, or are we sort of back to square one in terms of negotiations?
Well, we see them saying that they want to continue to abide by the limitations of New START. The Biden administration has said the same. So that's 700 delivery vehicles and 1,550 operationally deployed warheads. So they show at the moment some willingness to continue limitations. I'm not ready to say that when 2026 rolls around and New START goes out of force, that they're going to be willing to discard those limitations and proceed, because the US is modernizing its nuclear triad. I can't see the Russians having it in their interest to simply discard limitations that would affect reciprocally the United States as well. But we'll see. At the moment, Putin is being very bloody-minded and saying, you know, we'll decide what our interests are, and our interests do not include negotiating with you about nuclear weapons right now. You need to stop helping the Ukrainians. And that, to my mind, is simply an untenable kind of demand.
I want to run back for a moment to the premise that General Christman brought up, that there will not be a post-Ukraine war. And I mean, there's certainly the argument that Russia looks at the Ukraine war as a way of preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. And despite statements from NATO that Ukraine's future is in the alliance, we're sort of running up against the reality that so long as there's an active conflict in the country, it's difficult to bring it in because that could potentially trigger an automatic Article 5 declaration on the part of the Ukrainians. So do you think there is a potential actual post-war future, or do you think Russia will attempt to sustain a low level of conflict in order to preclude that? And if so, is there a way around that?
My own view, Matthew, in the absence of the black swan event that Rose has outlined, where there is a replacement for Putin, the collapse of the authoritarian regime that we see in front of us, I don't see in any reasonable future a likely at 32 agreement by the alliance to bring Ukraine in as a member for all the reasons that you mentioned. There's likely to be a continuing, as the NATO summit highlighted, programs by individual states to provide some form of security guarantee that's consistent with that individual state's sense of their own responsibilities. Some sensing for the funding that I guess NATO pledged, but was it 40 billion euro here over the near term, not continuing, but a 40 billion euro supplement to help with the NATO economic construction and military assistance. But I just don't see the chance that the alliance will at 32 access that sovereign nation. And it's the Russian attempt to unsettle the frontier and to unsettle the country that makes that accession, it seems to me, a virtual non-starter.
Ambassador Lute, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm concerned about two threads of what are emerging as conventional wisdom that I think we ought to challenge. One is that this is inevitably going to end up in some sort of unsettled stalemate arrangement. And the other is that Russia can simply outweigh the smaller, less populous Ukraine. And I think the challenge I would give to both of those, the stalemate argument and the sort of attrition argument, is that we haven't actually tried what is required. And that is to give Ukraine on time the capabilities that it needs to actually defeat the Russian occupation of Ukraine. So not defeat Russia as a nation state, but its occupation of Ukraine. And you know, the short history of the last 2.5 years is that we have, over time, given Ukraine military capabilities and very meaningful capabilities, but always 6 to 12 months late and typically in too few quantity. I mean, the most recent, we should remember, this all started with javelins, you know, the shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, and now we're talking about F-16s. Well, it took us 2.5 years to go from javelins to F-16s, and now that we're at F-16s, we're in the era of F-16s, we're only talking about tens of F-16s. You know, American leaders sometimes pat themselves on the back about how much we've done, but that needs to be measured against how much Ukraine needs, not historically how much we've provided, but how much Ukraine needs. And in particular, I think Ukraine has demonstrated that it is, first of all, a responsible military partner. It has abided by the caveats placed on our provision of military capabilities, so it's responsible. And second of all, it's developing its own military capabilities. I mean, Ukraine is striking deeper into Russian territory on legitimate military targets with Ukrainian indigenous systems than they are with the systems that we've provided and on which we've placed geographic constraints, range restrictions, right? So I'd like to test that conventional wisdom by removing the American caveats, especially American caveats, but also to a lesser extent French, British, and certainly prominently German caveats on the long-range precision strike systems given to Ukraine with the aim of defeating the Russian occupation. Now, if that defeat in Ukraine leads to internal domestic changes in Russia, then we're on to Rose's scenario and sort of over to the Russian people to figure out the future of Russia. But I'm reluctant to accept conventional wisdom until we test what Ukraine could do if we really took off the caveats. And one last thing on caveats, having survived the sort of 20 years of American bemoaning NATO allied caveats in places like Afghanistan, right? It's now curious that, we're placing caveats on a critical military partner, Ukraine, who's fighting for its life. So we once hated caveats and sort of yelled at allies behind closed doors about their caveats. And now we place caveats on Ukraine.
It's an interesting thing to explore, because when I think of it, and I think of sort of the way that NATO is somewhat caught flat-footed in this. I mean, we've seen that NATO did not have the supplies that it needed to sustain a long-term conventional war. And, it's only that this has not gone nuclear that we have needed this. And I think that some of the preparation for conflict prior to this assumed that a war with Russia would have, or the Soviet Union prior, would have gone nuclear so quickly that you didn't need stores and stores and stores of conventional artillery. When we look at what we've seen in Ukraine, seeing that the NATO allies have been so unprepared to actually supply the requirements en masse to defeat a Russian military en masse, does that change the way that the alliance looks at the conventional Russian military threat? If we look at the potential end of, or maybe not end of, this conflict, does the threat of a Russian conventional attack actually seem as feasible if the Russian military is drained, if the tools that we have used in this war and supplied the Ukrainians with have had a degree of mixed success against electronic warfare capabilities? I mean, do we look at conventional warfare in the same way? Does NATO need to be more prepared? Might they not worry as much? That's a lot of questions in one, but I'm just wondering what everybody thinks the actual conventional future deterrent looks like, and what degree is it necessary?
Well, I'm going to let my two military colleagues really answer this question, but I wanted to dive in with a remark I wanted to make about the real technology revolution that's visible in this Ukraine war. And I know I was just listening yesterday on the radio to General Milley and Eric Schmidt talking about their foreign affairs article and the advent of autonomous capability in this war, with the ability to control massive numbers of drones, and how that's changing the look of warfare, and indeed concerns expressed by the two of them that Russia is building up enormous drone factories to be able to pump these things out. And will NATO be ready for that? I think we are learning a lot from the Ukrainians. But I also want to foot stomp what Doug Lute said about the indigenous missile capability and capacity of the Ukrainians, which they are building up. They are great missileers. Let's not forget that they built the USSR's SS-18 major ICBM down at Dnipropetrovsk, and also they built the first solid rocket ballistic missiles at Pavlovsk. And so they are very good missileers themselves. President Zelensky just announced today that they have been testing for the first time a significant ballistic missile capability. So I think that they have a lot going for them in this regard, and they are showing NATO a lot about what the war of the future is gonna be like. But I really want to hear what Dan and Doug have to say about this as well.
What's a fascinating question, Matthew, with 100 different variables here. This conflict is the Spanish Civil War, as I think the Institute for the Study of War has, in their fascinating summary just over the last month or two, has tried to opine, to try to answer the question, technology that's being demonstrated on the battlefield in a way that is incredibly revealing. First comment, Doug, on the issue of your counterfactual, guys, just give the Ukrainians what they asked for earlier. You're exactly right. NATO has backfooted this delivery in ways that are really shameful. However, my reaction is, had the F-16s been provided much earlier, had we provided the M1s and the longer range ATACMS earlier, had we done the Patriot batteries that they really needed, I'm not sure the difference would have been all that significant, given the Russian ability to defend in depth. I think what has been certainly a surprise to the Ukrainians and even a surprise to our advisors is the way in which the Russians defended the territory they had seized, which indeed may be one of the reasons why Ukraine is penetrating into the oblast of Kursk now to create a killing field there, to erect the kinds of defenses forcing the Russians to come against them, the way the Russians did to force Ukraine and our equipment to come against them over the last couple of years. But that's a counterfactual that's going to be fascinating to analyze. On the issue, though, of lessons learned from this conflict, the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, besides this interesting comparison from 1936, 37 on the Spanish Civil War, made the comment that we can look at breakthroughs in military technology. Rose has discussed drones, the whole electronic spectrum that's being used tactically and operationally. All of these breakthroughs are numbered in the dozens. But what the Institute said was the real opportunity to regain maneuver, operational maneuver, goes to that side that's able to adapt most quickly. When there is a breakthrough in, let's say, electronic warfare capabilities, exploit that quickly in mass to create the opening, the penetration, and then to reinforce that, because the opportunity that's created by a technological breakthrough is going to be transitional. And in many respects, this adaptability and ingenuity on the part of the Ukrainians is one of their strong suits. It shows the vulnerability of Russia in their offense in February, March of 2022, and the ability of Ukraine to respond to that. So it's this combination of taking advantage of the technology opportunities that are there and doing it quickly, while that margin of opportunity rests with the attacker. In this case, if Ukraine wants to conduct a counteroffensive.
So the number one lesson that I take from the last 2.5 years of the war in Ukraine is that there are historical examples, and I think we're experiencing one now, where quality beats quantity. And all the qualitative factors of conventional war, to include the ability to innovate, like Dan just suggested, but also questions of morale, discipline, the purpose of the fight, right? The quality of the leadership and so forth. All of those things favor Ukraine. And there, I think here is a recent example added to historical experiences where smaller, higher quality armies can actually beat larger armies if they don't settle into simply a head-on-head war of attrition, right? And so I think that this incursion, this more than a raid, but I suppose incursion comes on into Kursk, right, is an example. Rather than attacking into the strength of the Russian defense, as Dan mentioned. So this is this in-depth. Dan's an army engineer, so he understands obstacles and minefields and defense in depth, right? Rather than attacking into that, which was the short history of last year's counteroffensive, right? The 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive. Ukraine has done a couple innovative things. First of all, it attacked where Russia was weak, not strong. And that was along its border with in the Kursk Oblast. But also it has overflown and attacked in depth the Russian vulnerabilities. So air bases, command and control nodes, supply nodes, and so forth, right? So this is a very operational application of this notion of innovation. The only other footnote I'd make to Dan's point about the strength of the Russian defenses in depth is that we, in my view, gave the Russians 18 months to prepare those defenses in depth. Our slow incremental provision of combined arms capability to the Ukrainians over the first sort of 12 to 18 months of the fight, right, was used wisely by the Russians to dig in. And so we faced a prepared defense because in part, we gave the Russians time to make that prepared defense.
Yeah, just a postscript here, Matthew, and Doug. That's of course that's right on the pause that we gave them. Here's one revelation, though, that I think the penetration, the oblast penetration that Ukraine has conducted reveals about the Russian defense, and that is how thin it is in areas along the rest of the frontier, except for the region opposite the 4 Ukrainian oblasts against which they're attacking. And the area that surprises me, where I think NATO has this opportunity to give Moscow nightmares, is along the Finnish border. From all indications, Russia has denuded their defense sectors in areas except for that region opposite Ukraine, to include what used to be called the Karelian Front, and to engage NATO operations, not permanently station the First Armored Division in Finland, but to conduct operations there where Russia's forces are thin, to demonstrate that should they attack, should they capture Kiev, or worse, should they go after the Russian-speaking enclave in Latvia, let's say, we've got the potential against your thin lines in Finland to go into the Kola Peninsula, against Murmansk. I mean, just to give nightmares to the Kremlin. So I think what's happened, what the military experience over the last 8 to 9 months, and especially the Kursk Oblast operation on the part of the Ukrainians, reveals is that interesting part that provides some opportunity for increased deterrence by NATO, now at 32.
You know, Matthew, one other quick, sorry, this conversation is full of footnotes and afterthoughts. You mentioned escalation, right? And of course, the conventional wisdom on why we took a very incremental approach to providing military capabilities is that we were unsure of where sort of the nuclear red line may lay for the Kremlin. But now we have 2.5 years of empirical evidence that where we imagined red lines or tripwires for a nuclear response by Russia, those red lines didn't actually exist. And in fact, I observed that when Putin has faced a choice between escalate and evacuate, he has repeatedly chosen evacuate. So think about the early weeks around Kyiv. Think about the collapse around Kharkiv later in 2022, the withdrawal, somewhat more organized, around the western bank of the Dnipro and the Kherson province. Think about the Black Sea Fleet. The Black Sea Fleet headquarters has moved where it has been evacuated further east. There are strategic air bases that have been moved eastward outside the range, well, at least the supposed range of Ukrainian capability. And now you see that even Ukrainian occupation of Russian territory for the first time by a foreign power since 1941, right? That Russia's ability to escalate is actually much more constrained than we imagined it to be. So one of the things I think we need to take into account here is that we have some empirical evidence about where Russia's red lines are, and then we need to adapt our operational approaches appropriately.
And based on that escalation, that comes back to sort of the central premise of the question I'm trying to figure out is, do you think that NATO will see Russia as being the same threat that it perceives it as either now or before this conflict? If the Russian military is weakened, incapable of, threatening NATO, and Ambassador Lute, you mentioned that earlier, or the idea of this threat. Is Russia seen as the same threat as it once was, or is it seen as more of a paper tiger that is, unable to beat what we would have probably considered before a second-rate military?
Yeah, I think we should be careful there, because if you consider Russian military capability, I think of it in 3 tiers, right? The top tier is the nuclear tier. They're not at all diminished in that tier, as Rose knows so well and has already expressed. The middle tier, the conventional military tier, on the ground side has been largely hollowed out by the attrition in the Ukraine conflict. I mean, they're reaching back deep into Cold War stocks for replacing tanks and artillery pieces and so forth, right? And we see in that conventional realm that the 10-year investment program that Putin invested in was largely hollowed out by way of corruption and underperformance and so forth, giving him the army that he invaded with in 2022. So that middle conventional tier is less than maybe we assessed. There's another tier below that, and that's this tier of gray zone, or as NATO says, sub-Article 5, sub-conventional attack capabilities like cyber, energy, election interference, misinformation, disinformation campaigns, and actually sabotage. And actually in that lower tier, we've actually seen an uptick in Russian attacks. So NATO can't rest here on the laurels of Ukrainian attrition of Russian conventional capabilities. And we have to pay attention to the whole spectrum.
Yeah, I wanted to agree just really quickly, because I was going to say that their lack of conventional capacity and capability and the destruction essentially of that capacity and capability drove them in the 1990s to depend more on their nuclear deterrent, and I think they will depend more on their nuclear deterrent now. But Doug makes a very important point. While I was at NATO in 16 to 19, it was already clear that at the level of this sub-Article 5, we were already seeing a lot of Russian innovation and a lot of significant attacks going on, which has only, this has doubled and tripled since this war in Ukraine. And I know that the allies in Europe are very concerned about Russian subversion in Europe. So this is where we have to be, I think, super prepared to defend ourselves, and we're not always on top of our game there.
Yeah, let me just add, I think that's exactly right. I don't see a NATO being lulled into overconfidence. Where I see NATO being perhaps lulled into is a period of indifference, driven by political exhaustion with what's going on. The timeline for democracies in terms of their ability to focus on an international crisis is not a long duration period of focus. And I think one already begins to see the periods of exhaustion setting in politically, and just underscores how important it is to use these counter-information, counter-propaganda organs that NATO and democracies have. And that tends to begin, in my judgment, at the leadership at the top. One, and Rose, your view on this would be appreciated. I've been encouraged by the selection of Mark Rutte, who is going to become the new Secretary General next month. Leadership at the top has incredible leverage, especially now. I guess I saw one brief article about Mark Rutte that he's known in some circles as the Trump whisperer, someone who's able to discuss with the candidate for the president and keep the discussion at an even keel. Who knows whether that's going to be helpful in the coming months? But the point is, there have been secretaries general in the past that have not been leading from the front for complicated reasons, others that have been inspirational, others who have been consensus builders. And if we need this right now, at a time when democracies are so threatened by information campaigns from the East and split within the alliance, East-West. During my time, it was mostly North-South, but now the East-West tensions between older NATO members and traditional, it really does require leadership at the top. And I think the selection of the new Secretary General is crucial on that, as will be, candidly, the new American administration.
Well, let me just add that.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
This
may be the same point.
Well, I'll just very quickly say that Rutte, I observed him in meetings with Trump while I was DSG, and indeed he was very, very good at talking with Mr. Trump in exactly the way Jens Stoltenberg has been very good at engaging and addressing Mr. Trump's concerns about burden sharing and so forth. I saw that kind of capability too in Mark Rutte. But I think the more important thing, frankly, is that Rutte is one of the most experienced leaders in Europe now with 14 years of experience, having been the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. Coming into this job, he can pick up the phone and call any leader across Europe, the United States and Canada. That is a super valuable capability to have as the Secretary General of NATO. I just want to put a plug in. It's time to choose the right Deputy Secretary General now. I know there's a lot of attention to choosing somebody from the Balkans. I think that's the right idea. Get some of the new members engaged at the top of the NATO leadership, and I very much hope that it's going to be a woman. There are some very capable female leaders in the Balkans. I think that having someone from that region and who happens to be female would be great.
So Rose, I was thinking that you might be once again available, but the Balkans would also be great. Look, while we're on the leadership topic, we shouldn't dismiss Jens Stoltenberg's, I think, historic role over a decade. So he came into office in 2014 on the wake of Russia's illegal seizing of Crimea, destabilizing the Donbass, and the rise of the Islamic State to NATO's immediate south in northern Syria and northern Iraq. He saw the initial response through that. He saw a historically challenging period during the 4 years of the Trump administration, and he's now led the response after the 2022 invasion. I think he'll go down in history as one of the most responsive, the most sort of challenging, providing great leadership during the most challenging period in NATO history. And I think that the Medal of Freedom that President Biden awarded him at the July summit in Washington was among the most deserving medals of freedom awarded.
Nice.
Just to wrap up with one final question that I think this touches on a little bit in the few moments that we have remaining. It's coming back to the initial comments I had on NATO's defense spending, which we, of course, know is particularly important to all presidential candidates from the United States. But as we look at NATO's defense spending and seeing that even after that initial 2014 invasion, and then after the Ukraine larger scale invasion in 2022, we're still at a point where only 2/3 of the alliance members are meeting their 2% level. I mean, do we see this as something that's going to continue in a positive trend? Or if this conflict comes to an end, could we enter an era of complacency where, again, we drop back to the point where not everybody's spending what they should be spending?
Well, look, the data here is pretty clear, right? When the Wales Pledge was signed in 2014 under President Obama, there were 3 allies at or above 2%, right? And as Rose has rightly said, in 2014, the pledge was to move towards 2% in the course of a decade, right? So in 2024, we're at the end of that decade. Where do we stand? The count is now 23 out of 32. Now, frankly, it's 23 out of 31 because Iceland has no armed forces, right? So, but anyway, you get the point. We've gone from 3 to 23. That's a big step in a decade. Often I take the question of who's more responsible here. Was it Obama, right, who under whom the pledge was signed in 2014, or was it President Trump who brought this in a very public way to the forefront, right? And I said, you got the wrong president. It was President Putin who is actually most responsible for NATO's move from 3 to 23. And as Americans, we should be a little more humble about our ability to change domestic politics across the NATO democratic landscape. It was really, I think, the sea change in threat perception by the European allies that have seen them do the right thing, which is invest.
Yeah, maybe my last comment on this, and I pick up on what Doug had to say about domestic politics. I think the will is there across leadership teams in Europe, but domestic politics is something that we'll have to continue to work to bring along. I know Germany has very unlike where they were 5 years ago when I was DSG and Angela Merkel was arguing with President Trump and saying, look, we can't reach 2% of GDP until the 2030s. That argument has gone away under Chancellor Scholz now, but they're still not getting the budget numbers they need out of the German parliament. So, you know, how do we help countries across the NATO alliance square these domestic political circles? And there, I think, again, Doug is right. It's going to be President Putin and the threats that he imposes on NATO that's probably going to be more helpful than anything else in doing that. But we need to keep up the moral suasion. We need to keep up, you know, the clear message that this is what it's all about, being a responsible NATO ally. That is not only pledging 2% of GDP, but also being willing to spend it and indeed treat it not so much as a ceiling, but as a floor these days.
And Matthew, to the second part of your question, if there is a relaxation in tensions, for all of the reasons that we've discussed a bit, if that relaxation period sets in, it will be that much harder to go above the 23 who are now spending 2%. It's just the realities of European politics in general, but it also includes the American scene as well. The difficulty of making the argument for defense spending during a period of relaxation of tensions with the East.
All right. Well, on that note, I want to thank everybody for the time they've taken to participate with us today, and for our audience members for attending. And also want to make a special note to thank our former intern, Rachel Rochford, who actually took the initiative to help us build this event out. So thank you, Rachel, for helping us organize. And I hope you all have a great day, and be sure to check out our website for future upcoming events and for recording of this video after we get it posted in the next couple of days. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Nicely done, Matthew.